welcome back for my Religion 328 video presentation for religion, race, and the legacy of Cain and Abel. Before we get started today, I just like to give a general disclaimer saying this is not a moral judgment on the Bible or Christianity itself. People are bound to interpret the text very differently, but the point of this video is to demonstrate how very bad people use the Bible in bad ways to justify doing bad things to enslaved people. Now, without further ado, let's get started. So, for our final project, we essentially had to tackle one of our discussion questions, and this is how my discussion question went. In The Way of Cain, the author says that people interpret Cain as advancing evil to the extent that not only does he increase his wickedness, but becomes a teacher of evil activity to others. WASP Society describes continental and diasporic African culture as being satanic and immoral. Hip hop and rap are examples of black cultural artifacts that have been unjustly vilified by WASP societies. If enslavers justified the enslavement of black people because they are, and I quote, descendants of Cain and inherently evil, how did this ideology justify and persist how WASP society views black culture? Does this biblical interpretation have anything to do with the societal misconceptions of these cultural practices and corresponding racial stereotypes? How was paternalism justified? So now we get to our talking point. Our first talking point is that we're going to be situated in the United States paradigm-wise, or in broad senses, North America. But for this first point, I'm going to say that the racial designation of Cain and Abel's lineage enables binary dichotomies that perpetuate racial stereotypes and white supremacy. Racial WASP interpretations of the mark of Cain, seeing black people as inferior and morally inept without white guidance, contributes to the rhetoric of black people being perceived as gangster, intimidating, dangerous, amongst other extremely demonizing stereotypes. This is a form of othering, and being compared to Cain's lineage creates an us versus them dichotomy, as quoted by Edward Said in his article Orientalism. The second point we'll be talking about Apocrypha. WASP society's disproportionate vilification of black people comes from the biblical interpretation and Apocrypha detailing how Cain's lineage is extremely morally inferior and will poison the rest of society. Due to this, WASP American society disproportionately demonizes black people and their cultural artifacts too, because of Apocrypha's influence on demonizing Cain and his lineage, and is translated to black people. This has really consequential effects when it comes to this current uprising in black agency, black independence, and resistance. So my third point will be about paternalism, the Old Testament, and the antebellum period. So enslavers did not just use Genesis 4:15, that's where the mark of Cain was originally said, in justifying how they saw black people as inferior and as commodities for the institution of slavery. They used other sections of the Old Testament, such as the Curse of Ham, Ephesians, Colossians, which include the differentiating of black people as morally inferior and needing to submit to their pious masters as a form of justifying their slavery paternalism during the antebellum period. They try to enforce their interpretations of these texts to get enslaved peoples to submit to the institution of slavery through brutally oppressing slave revolts. So before we get into my actual analysis, I'd just like to introduce a few key terms that you may not be familiar with. So, first of all, WASPs. So, the term WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and it refers to a demographic group of white Americans of British descent who were often Protestant Christians. In the American context, these are the people at the upper echelon of the socioeconomic political hierarchy. In the context of the institution of slavery in the United States, this group was the most dominant social and economic groups that participated in and benefited from the enslavement of black people. And during the era of slavery, many WASPs owned slaves, particularly in the southern states, where large-scale plantation agriculture was the entire backbone of the southern economy. These people were the ones who were rallying the most to uphold the institution of slavery, to uphold the institution of white supremacy. So, paternalism in the context of slavery refers to the attitude or system where slaveholders or masters claim to act in the best interest of their slaves. It's giving Kanye West saying slavery was actually really good for black people in the sense that black people were treated well, which is just entirely not true. Um, but this approach justifies the subjugation of individuals by asserting that they are incapable of making decisions for themselves and need the guidance and control of white people for their own well being. It is essentially a way for slaveholders to rationalize their ownership and to be morally justified in owning and making human beings a commodity. So, the next concept is extremely dominant in anthropology and geography. This concept is called othering, and it originated from Edward Said in his book called Orientalism. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but it essentially speaks about the binary dichotomy in which we tend to categorize others. And this concept is most commonly used when talking about Western imperialism and how it shapes Western perceptions of racialized cultures and nations. So, on our syllabus, it said that we need to include a portion in this final project where we link this back to the course content and justify why we're doing the project. So, this entire class, we read the Bible, analyzed it, and we found that enslavers tried to justify the institution of slavery biblically through the story of Cain and Abel. Please keep in mind that due to wasps holding control over the institution of slavery, they wanted an undebatable divine justification to uphold the institution through anti black subjugation. My topic relates to the course content because our entire course revolves around Cain and Abel's legacy in shaping American social paradigms pertaining to anti blackness. Essentially, we learned in class that the Old Testament is written really, really bluntly with not a lot of descriptive details to perpetrate a entirely cohesive narrative that can be interpreted the same amongst all peoples. So, in that spirit, people can interpret the Bible however they want and project their own narratives on this vague holy text. My second subpoint about Cain and Abel, Genesis 4:15. So enslavers basically interpreted the mark of Cain as a designation for racial phenotypical features. This rhetoric continues with the Old Testament's plotline about Cain and Abel's supposed lineage and descendants. Enslavers also took the Apocrypha to fuel their narratives too about how Cain is a teacher of wrongdoings. We also explored many different interpretations regarding what Cain's lineage represents to other people regarding racial and social interpretations of their legacy as a result. So, TLDR, too long didn't read, the mark of Cain and Cain's descendants are interpreted as a racial designation, and we explored through our course readings that enslavers used the Apocrypha and direct texts from the Bible to designate inherent moral characteristics to Cain's descendants, and in this context, we will be talking about black people specifically, that justified the institution of slavery. So, before I start on the concrete analysis of this section, I would just like to say that academics and scholars have come to the consensus that race is a social construct meant to perpetrate unequal power dynamics between racial groups. In the United States, the social construction of race dominates all facets of society and hinges on the idea that black people are, quote, and I quote, inferior. But this associative dichotomy of black and white, Cain and Abel, good and bad, bears resemblance to Edward Said's process of othering. And particularly in the United States, too, the entire social racial structure there is pitted so that black people are economically, socially, and politically disenfranchised to extreme amounts. So while I explain this to you, I really want you to mentally construct this binary hierarchy between Abel, traditionally interpreted as white people, and Cain's lineage, black people. The Old Testament, the book of Genesis, is really paradoxically vague, yet blunt at the same time. Between the two brothers, the damning evidence is that Cain killed his brother in a field, and that binary construct is essentially all that we have to designate inherent moral characteristics to Cain and to Abel. So Edward Said's process of othering also relies on this binary dichotomy too. The other is perceived in Edward Said's concept as inferior, uncivilized, and needs Western intervention and control. The binary concept of the other draws parallels with Cain on the grounds that the other, Cain, is morally inferior, morally inept, evil to a certain extent. Through constructing the other as uncivilized, inferior, and in need of WASP intervention, we define ourselves as the antithesis to the other. So if Cain inherently is bad, then Abel has to be good. This is why white supremacists tend to align themselves more with Abel's lineage in comparison to Cain's lineage, where they would designate people of color as descending from Cain's lineage. This continuous process of othering, as cited in many academic sources, fuels racialization and the inherent negative characteristics that the institution of white supremacy designates to racialized people, to black people. In this self explanatory titled article, Race as a Social Construct, the author says that social construction of race shapes the history of North America through exploration and colonization. Lineage based concepts of race gave rise to physical characteristics and personality characteristics that colonizers designated to racial groups. To quote directly from the article, African servants' physical distinctiveness provided an added impetus towards racialized servitude, as skin color became a convenient marker of service that made running away all the more difficult. As servitude became increasingly racialized and lifelong, prejudice toward African Americans developed because they had become associated with the lowest possible economic status. The quote I just mentioned to you describes the binary process of racialization or othering enslaved peoples went through at the hand of enslavers. In comparison to white Americans, who portrayed themselves as the antithesis to these demeaning and dehumanizing stereotypes, white Americans portrayed enslaved people as childlike, lazy, dirty, constructing white Americans' own image of being intelligent, hardworking, and clean. This once again reflects the binary dichotomy of Cain and Abel's interpretive legacy and resembles a represented and convenient self-serving means for white elites to justify and naturalize existing inequalities. They did this by denigrating black people as deserving of nothing better or representing them as content with, and I quote, their lot in life. So, long story short, race is a social construct created by those in power. In this American context, these people are WASPs. And American Africans were being portrayed as the other in American racial hierarchy. In the context of Cain and Abel, American WASP society designated them as Cain. This leads to the question: how did misconstrued interpretations of the Old Testament contribute to this current social paradigm of vilifying African Americans and their cultural artifacts? These biblical justifications of slavery included the inherent differentiation of black people as morally inferior. These interpretations were created to justify a distinct racial hierarchy through which the beneficiaries of the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, and anti-black oppression could profit from. Apocrypha detailing discourse on Cain helped fuel and contextualize contemporary racial scapegoating of African Americans as evil, scary, and poisoning American society. WASPs thought that African Americans did this through teaching American society values that are antithetical to WASP values. This is where I bring in one of our class readings, The Way of Cain. This article argues that the Apocrypha blew up Cain's significance as the first murderer out of proportion in comparison to what the actual Old Testament says. The article argues that Cain's crime became the archetype of wrongdoing. I argue that this apocryphal narrative contributes to WASPs stereotyping black men and women as being inherently violent and homicidal. The Apocrypha exaggerates and demonizes Cain, how American WASPs demonize black people. WASP society insinuates that black people are inherently evil, violent, and like Cain, will pass on their immorality to the rest of society. 3 examples that I've taken from The Way of Cain include 10:4 Josephus stating that Cain is the reason for the flood, Cain is the institution, teacher, and progenitor of all evil, and that Cain and his children are responsible for the decline of humanity. The third example, Cain is described as advancing evil to the extent that not only does he increase his own wickedness, but he even becomes a teacher of evil activities to others. The Apocrypha interpreting Cain inciting violence and corruption on others bears resemblance to how WASP Society blames black people for corrupting society contemporarily. A really good salient example of this comes from Koza's article about rap music as a means of official politics. Koza heavily emphasizes how the media and general American public project this narrative of black people using rap and hip hop to incite gang violence, drug usage, and promiscuity in American society's adolescents and young adults. In both of these contexts, the Apocrypha and American WASP Society exaggerate Cain and black people's supposed moral fallacies. WASP enslavers also interpreted being phenotypically black as the mark of Cain. Additionally, the Apocrypha and American WASP Society demonize Cain and his representatives, giving cause to believe that WASP enslavers projected Apocrypha's exaggeration of Cain as immoral onto black people. So, this final section, Paternalism, the Antebellum Period, and the Old Testament, seeks to argue that the Old Testament played a vital role in perpetuating and justifying paternalism. First and foremost, paternalism, as a subgenre of the biblically justified institution of slavery, thrives off of the idea that black people are inferior to their white enslavers. This ideology basically operates through othering, as I stated before. White supremacists deem African Americans as inferior because they quote unquote come from Cain's lineage. In Cole's article, The Excuse of Paternalism in the Antebellum South, he details that during the antebellum period, pro-slavery paternalists within plantations viewed paternalism as, and I quote, reciprocal duties within which the master had a duty to provide for his people and treat them with humanity. Cole sums it up with how this ideology allowed whites to exercise their superior status with relatively no guilty conscience. Additionally, WASPs use paternalism as a manipulation technique to manipulate enslaved people with being okay with their oppression. So, paternalists essentially upheld white supremacist ideals by vouching for the institution of slavery and pulling quotes from the New and Old Testament to build upon WASP interpretations of the mark of Cain. The book Denmark Vesey's Bible by our Professor Skipper stated, and I quote, slavery was consistent with scripture and could not be considered a moral or spiritual evil, which included Genesis 4:15, which speaks about the mark of Cain, and the curse of Ham in Genesis 9:20 to 9:27. Another really damning quote from the New Testament includes Ephesians 6:5, which goes, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. They also believed the institution of slavery itself was not evil or harmful to black people, which we know is just plain wrong at this point. It's extremely important to note that because enslavers were the people who created this paternalistic rhetoric, this framework revolves around the enabling of enslavers' lack of moral accountability within the institution of slavery. So these biblical texts in this context constructed this inherent moral framework that enslavers used to justify abusing, commodifying, and subjugating black people. And it's also very worth noting, too, that paternalism did not use biblical texts to encourage enslavers to be pious and kind to enslaved people. Paternalism used biblical texts to enable abusing enslaved people, essentially. Paternalism, at face value, presents itself as an ideology ensuring mutual respect. However, the aforementioned quotes from the Old and New Testament were only pulled out when putting leaders of black resistance, such as Denmark Vesey, on trial. The way enslavers used these texts were essentially antithetical to the relationship of mutual benevolence paternalism emphasized. That speaks for itself. Anyway, thank you so much for watching my little video presentation. I really appreciate it. Have a good day.